Get started momentarily with our guest. Mark Sheldon is here. Mark, thank you so much for being with us today. I have a little introduction for Mark. And Mark was here, a year ago, almost to the day, with a presentation for us on Hong Kong. And we're excited to have him back with Is Taiwan Really the Next Ukraine? And Mark Sheldon has lived and worked in Hong Kong, mainland China, and the Philippines and Taiwan for over 40 years. He received his BA in political science at Illinois Wesleyan University and his MA in Asian Studies and International Relations from the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and the East-West Center. Most recently, Mr. Sheldon was the Hong Kong office director for the Yale-China Association, based at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where he also taught in the International Asian Studies program for 4 decades. He was the founding director of the Office of Academic Links International of the Chinese University and served on many university and community bodies related to Asian studies, higher education exchange, and Asian philanthropy. Recently, Mr. Sheldon was a senior fellow at the Hong Kong America Center, the Fulbright Commission, based at Chung Chi College at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and he previously served as the director of the center. He has a long relationship with the international school sector in Hong Kong, especially the Hong Kong International School, where he served for several years as the director of Office of Institutional Advancement. And he's now retired and based in Central Illinois, close to his other university, his beloved alma mater, Illinois Wesleyan University, where he assists with international student recruitment and alumni relations. And he's coming to us, I always like to say, from Normal, Illinois, and we love to know that there are normal places in the world these days. And again, Mark, we're very excited to have you back with us today and very much appreciate your time.
Okay, Scott, it's very wonderful to be with you all again. I want to thank Ali and thank Scott and his team for inviting me today. And I'm pleased to see the level of interest in this topic. After the invasion of Ukraine, there was a lot of glib talk about comparing what was happening in Ukraine with the possible invasion of Taiwan. So I thought it would be a very good idea to take a look at this and see what kind of policy comparisons there might be and what kind of situation we face now across the Taiwan Straits. This is a topic that I've been teaching about for over 40 years. So in a sense, it's very important to sort of step back and see some of the history of the Taiwan issue in US-China relations, and to realize that this is what we call in our teaching a hardy perennial of an issue in US-China relations. When we talk about this issue, we always compare it to the other 2 hardy perennials, which are in the Asia-Pacific region, which were always potential flashpoints, potential conflict points. Those being the challenge of the North Korean nuclear program and the possible conflict over competing claims in the South China Sea. But to be frank, always the Taiwan question was the largest and most concerning of all these hardy perennials. So in a sense, this is not at all a new issue. This is a central and core issue in possible conflict between the US and China. So what I'd like to do is just step back a little bit and talk a little bit about the perceptions of this issue by the People's Republic, by Taiwan itself, the Republic of China on Taiwan, and then, of course, in terms of US policy, historically and in the last few years, particularly as US-China relations reached their lowest point in decades, particularly during the Trump administration. So to step back a bit, to start out with the People's Republic's view of the Taiwan matter, keep in mind that this is part of the unresolved civil war. From Beijing's point of view, the nationalists fled the mainland to Taiwan as they succeeded in this Chinese Civil War to establish the People's Republic of China. So in a sense, particularly when the nationalists were in power in Taiwan, this was clearly, in the view of Beijing, an unresolved civil war. Beijing has always claimed Taiwan as part of China, claimed that Taiwan is a province of China, and that issues related to Taiwan are an internal matter of Chinese policy. From the very beginning of the Chinese Communist Revolution, part of their political platform was to restore China to its previous status, to its previous glory, and to recover all territories that had been lost during the period of colonial domination in China. It seemed during that period of China's great weakness, during the period of extraterritoriality and of colonial domination in China, that the more China resisted, the more foreigners or foreign colonial powers showed up to establish concessions in China and to take pieces of China and to penetrate into the Chinese society and economy through military power, through missionaries, through cultural penetration, and through domination of various types. So any self-respecting nationalist, particularly any self-respecting Chinese communist nationalist, has always seen the Taiwan matter as a core nationalistic issue. It's an issue on which no respecting nationalist leader in China, in the People's Republic, could afford to be soft. So keeping in mind the power of nationalism as the Chinese Communist movement took power, the Taiwan matter has historically, from the very beginning up till the present day, always been a matter of a core value, a core principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty. So I think it behooves us all to remember how dramatic and how important this issue is to the ethos of the Chinese Communist Party and of the government of the People's Republic of China. Of course, in more recent years, this approach of the PRC has taken on, in a sense, greater sensitivity as China has developed economically and become the second, if not the first, most powerful economy in the world. China has sought constantly to recover these lost territories, be it Hong Kong, be it Macau, be it Chinese control of certain parts of Central Asia, particularly Tibet, areas where there are Muslim minorities that are actually in the majority in those areas, and certainly Taiwan. So this has been a hardy, perennial, consistent policy of the PRC dating back to the very founding of the People's Republic in 1949. And I think it's fair to say that under Xi Jinping, the urgency of this issue, the urgency of recovering Hong Kong and Macau, the urgency of making these territories more fully a part of the political realm and political system of China, has taken on even greater urgency. And certainly China now has, economically and now militarily as well, greater capacity to try to pursue these policies of fully recovering what they perceive to be as these lost territories. So Xi Jinping now is pursuing a far more assertive foreign policy, assertive in many parts of the region, certainly very assertive in terms of the new policies of control and of repression in Hong Kong. And these new assertive policies, of course, reverberate and have a very strong implication for the authorities in Taiwan and for the status and health of US-China relations. I think it's fair to say that these policies have led to many important changes, both in Taiwan and in the US policy toward the People's Republic. Many of us enjoyed the pinnacle of cooperation, of strategic partnership, of exchange, of positive collaboration between the US and China. But I'm afraid those days are now greatly challenged, if not over, and that has had a striking implication for the status and possible future for Taiwan. So we're now at a sensitive point in China politically as well. I guess I can't emphasize enough today how in each of these three areas, in the mainland, in Taiwan, and the US, we have political dynamics and economic and social dynamics and questions of values and identity that are quite detrimental to the possibility for peace across the Taiwan Straits. So I'm sorry to say that this era of cooperation, of engagement, of collaboration between the US and China in so many sectors is now being challenged, if not ended, what's usually referred to as decoupling. And so the status of US-China relations and the context in which Taiwan then must operate is in a much more negative and detrimental phase in the last few years than was previously the case in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And why is it so sensitive in China now? Well, Xi Jinping faces a very delicate political moment of significant party meetings upcoming in the next few weeks. He's seeking an unprecedented third term in his leadership. And things aren't really going that well for him in China. Economically, there are more grumblings under the surface than there have been in recent years, largely due to the policies that China has pursued related to the COVID-19 pandemic, what's usually referred to as dynamic COVID control. And this has led to major lockdowns, as I'm sure many of you have read, led to significant damage in the growth rates of the Chinese economy, and therefore presents a very sensitive moment, a great challenge for the leadership of Xi Jinping and his colleagues. And the normal way that leaders of China react when this kind of challenge occurs is, of course, to be more repressive, to be more controlling. And that certainly was the experience we had in Hong Kong since the establishment of the new national security law and really the ending of any notion of the one country, two systems policy. The one country, two systems policy in Hong Kong, of course, was earlier presented to Taiwan as a possible option for the future status of Taiwan. And given what's happened in Hong Kong and the tremendous difficulties of the pro-democracy movement there, the decapitation of civil society, and the negative retrograde reformation of the electoral system in Hong Kong, that is not a model that anyone in Taiwan, of course, would want to embrace. So you have an entirely new political context, given what has happened in Hong Kong, for people in Taiwan perceiving what might be their future if they were to be re-embraced by the motherland. So internal to China, there are some very delicate nationalistic issues that Xi Jinping faces, his leadership faces, related to the dramatic shrinking of the PRC economy and the very significant decline in the economic growth rates in the mainland economy. That often has been projected as being a formula for political instability. So we will see in the coming weeks how Xi Jinping maneuvers through this set of leadership meetings, through the rumblings that exist about the lockdowns and the COVID policies, and then what implication that might have for US-China relations going forward. Now, how about Taiwan? Now, Taiwan has been a de facto independent entity since the PRC was established. It had a period of repression and martial law of its own. When I studied in Taiwan in the early 70s, the Kuomintang or Nationalist Party was still in power, utilizing martial law and repressive tactics to stay in power, still declaring that a state of war existed across the Taiwan Straits. But in Taiwan, there's been a process of democratization and reform, a process of dramatic economic growth, a process of flourishing civil society, and now 4 or 5 peaceful transitions of power through free and fair elections. So democracy taking root on Chinese soil within the context of this small island entity or island state, and the flowering of Taiwanese identity. Perhaps you know that in Taiwan, about 2 million of the population are the people who came over from the mainland at the time of the Chinese Civil War in 1948, 49, 50, 51. And roughly 21, 22 million people in Taiwan are Taiwanese. They are ethnically Chinese, most of them coming from Fujian province over to Taiwan historically, although there are some other populations that are not ethnic Chinese. But those people in Taiwan have their own cultural, social, linguistic identity, and now have their own political expression through the opposition party that has now taken power in Taiwan, the Democratic Progressive Party, which is headed up by the current Taiwan president, a woman academic by the name of Tsai Ing-wen. So what you have in Taiwan is a society quite divergent from the authoritarian one-party state of the mainland, yet economically an entity that is highly integrated with China, with South China, particularly with Fujian province, and has been able to grow and maintain its identity, find its own pathway, even while having extremely limited international space and extremely limited diplomatic recognition due to the fact that most countries in the world, including the United States, recognize the People's Republic of China as China, and therefore, as an official policy, say that Taiwan is part of China, yet the status of Taiwan is still to be resolved and worked out in the future between the people of Taiwan and the mainland themselves. Hopefully with the assurance that this process of resolution of the status of Taiwan would be done in a peaceful fashion. But the mainland has never, ever said that it will guarantee that this process of resolution or reunification or federation or whatever that status might mean or how it would be developed would necessarily have to be done in a peaceful fashion. So this conflict now involves a one-party authoritarian state which claims Taiwan to be fully part of China, and an entity which is now divergent socially, culturally, even linguistically, divergent from the mainland, certainly divergent politically, yet quite integrated economically. So it's a very ironic, very complex reality of Taiwanese identity, Taiwanese social and political divergence, yet economic integration with the fast-growing mainland, which of course is now exhibiting these economic problems with many sources, problems mainly related in the short term to the COVID pandemic. In fact, this identity divergence is so great that many in Taiwan now do not say they are Chinese. They say they are Taiwanese, and they want to be separate. They want to have the social and political divergence protected and maintained. And they have a vibrant society with civil society organizations, with the flowering of Taiwanese cultural identity occurring. So it's a very different social reality than what is occurring on the mainland. And of course, many people from Taiwan over the last 3 decades or so have traveled to mainland China. Over 1 million people from Taiwan now work in mainland China. And many of them make it very clear that they do not want to be a part of the one-party socialist system in the mainland. They want to maintain the status quo or maintain their autonomy. A very small portion of the Democratic Progressive Party even advocates for independence of Taiwan, which of course would be an anathema to the authorities and the leaders in the People's Republic. So there you have it, a very complicated, economically merging, yet socially, politically, culturally divergent relationship between the People's Republic and Taiwan, or the Republic of China on Taiwan. Tsai Ing-wen's term will end pretty soon. She has been in for 2 terms, and so there will be another election upcoming in Taiwan. And of course, the Nationalist Party, the party that argued for reunification and was the losing party of the Chinese Civil War, this mainland-based party, has had to reform and revise itself and try to come up with a way to compete in Taiwan's vibrant democracy. And I think it's fair to say that most of us don't feel that the Nationalist Party in Taiwan can ever again win an island-wide election. So it seems that we're likely to have, for some years to come, the ruling authorities in Taiwan to be the Democratic Progressive Party, which does more fully represent the aspirations of the Taiwanese people on Taiwan, and has a position that wishes to maintain the status quo, or at least maintain Taiwan's political and social autonomy. Some factors within that party are more militant, more radical, you might say. And so there is the issue of what would happen if Taiwan would wish to declare its formal independence. Of course, that would lead to a very serious confrontation with the mainland. Now, what about US policy? The formulation of US policy with the People's Republic related to Taiwan goes back all the way to the Nixon visit and the so-called Shanghai Communique, which was a document that led up to the formal diplomatic recognition between the US and the People's Republic in 1979. So from the period of 1972-73, and then some subsequent documents that were also agreed to between the US and China, the matter of Taiwan has basically been an unresolved issue an issue on which there was agreement that the US would recognize China and that Beijing was the sole capital of the People's Republic and that Taiwan was part of China, but that issue would be resolved later, would be resolved peacefully. And then there were aspects on which the US and China basically agreed to disagree. They agreed to set this aside to allow for diplomatic relations to be established, and that then the Taiwan matter would be put off down the road. And it has been put off down the road in various forms through various subsequent agreements between the US and China for all these years. And in the meantime, of course, the US Congress stepped in and also established what's known as the Taiwan Relations Act, which allowed for a kind of semi-official, official relation between the US and Taiwan, and allowed for a commitment on the part of the US government to defend the people of Taiwan, not the government, because the US does not have full diplomatic relations with the government of Taiwan, only the government of the People's Republic. So you can see it's a bit murky. And that commitment involved the ongoing sale of military equipment to Taiwan to allow Taiwan to defend itself should there be at some point an invasion of Taiwan by mainland China. And that has always been a sticking point, a point at which there's always been objection from the PRC side. Every time these military aid packages come up, several times hundreds of millions of dollars, several times more than that. The PRC objects to this, the US goes forward with it, and you have this ongoing conflict or tension between the US and China. As China became stronger, became economically more powerful, of course, the sort of balance of military involvement related to Taiwan started to shift, and these packages had to become bigger. These packages had to become somewhat more frequent. So you could see that the unresolved aspects of the US-China relationship related to Taiwan became more and more complicated, more and more tense. That particularly accelerated during the administration of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump also took on mainland China on many other aspects of the relationship, particularly on trade and investment and on the competition over technology. So you have a situation under the Trump administration where many actions were taken to contradict Chinese theft of intellectual property. Actions were taken related to unfair trading practices. And so sanctions were given toward China, quite severe sanctions in some ways, trade sanctions. And that led, of course, to the US consumer basically paying for these sanctions in the very substantial economic and trade relationship between the US and China, which has really not been successful in decoupling almost at all. We can say in the economic and trade relationship, except in a few militarily sensitive areas, a few technology areas, we still have an incredibly significant trade relation with China. And those sanctions basically were a form of tax on the US consumer. They did not seem to really change the structural problems that were supposedly addressed by those tariffs. And we have to admit that into the first 2 years of the Biden administration, those policies have not substantially changed, nor have these tariffs been reduced or eliminated. So we still are in this quite tense structural relationship between the US and China. even while hoping that the relationship between the US and China could produce positive benefits in other areas of needed cooperation. Those areas include the nuclear program of North Korea. China has incredible leverage on the North Korean regime and would be probably the most imperative partner in trying to solve that question of eliminating or reducing the nuclear threat of the North Korean regime. Also in the area of climate change, I mean, the US and China are the large emitters and certainly have a major role to play in any resolution of climate change problems. And so the need for the US and China to have a positive, cooperative, and collaborative relationship is so evident in these other areas, yet there are so many points of disagreement, so many points of conflict. And of course, not least over China's human rights record, historically, domestically, in China itself, more recently over the repression of Muslims and Uyghurs in the West, the Northwest of China. And then since 2020, the repression and arrests and the era of persecutions and prosecutions as a result of the new national security law in Hong Kong. So all those areas have caused in the United States a bipartisan anti-China view within Congress. You can't find now in the US political landscape, it's very hard to find those who argue for a collaborative relationship with China, those who argue for cooperation or for academic exchange or for the Fulbright program or any of the areas where we had in the 80s and 90s dramatic areas of cooperation, of which that was my entire career actually, of managing and pursuing and advocating for a positive and collaborative relationship with China in many sectors, be it trade, investment, technology, education, law, environment. I mean, you name the areas, and we had various protocols and various points of agreement, various points of cooperation with our colleagues and our friends in the People's Republic. Those partners and friends are all still there. We're all still in contact with them, but now it's a point of the nadir of US-China cooperation, and most of those things have waned, if not stopped entirely. Many of us also have dear friends in Taiwan because we were graduate school classmates, or we did language study in Taiwan, or we worked with our colleagues and collaborators in Taiwan. And we're extremely concerned about the prospect of war breaking out in the Taiwan Strait. We have dear friends and partners and collaborators and colleagues, and many friends in this country have relatives on both sides of the Taiwan Straits. And we don't want to see what would be an incredibly disastrous outcome if there were to be conflict across the Taiwan Strait, both for China and Taiwan itself, but for the region and certainly for the United States as well. So that the US policy has been one of recognizing the People's Republic of China, as the sole legitimate government of China, and saying that Taiwan is part of China, but that the status of Taiwan should be worked out between the people of China and Taiwan themselves in a peaceful manner. Yet that doesn't seem to be the scenario of increased military development on the mainland, increased armaments and supply of military equipment on the Taiwan side by the US government. It seems to be building up to a conflict, period. And you have on these two sides different between Putin's notion of Ukraine and Ukraine's notion of Ukraine. Quite a bad stew, quite a bad mixture of different social systems, political systems, now military buildup, and big power competition. So the US policy was always about its degree of help for Taiwan, its degree of wanting to assist Taiwan should there be a conflict, or should Taiwan itself provoke a conflict by declaring independence, or if the mainland would seek to recover Taiwan by military means. The US policy was always one of strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity. What does this mean? This means we're not really saying what we're going to do. We're helping the Taiwan side. We have a major military presence in the Pacific region. We've even rebalanced our military strategy under the Obama years to shift many of our military capabilities to the Asia Pacific region. That process is continuing. We've even shifted our notion of alliances and our notion of language related to how we interact with the Asian region. It's now known as the Indo-Pacific. The US government and the US aligned groups don't say Asia Pacific region much now. They say Indo-Pacific because that's the new Quad. The Quad is Australia, India,
Apologies, everybody. Mark's having some internet issues today, and his video has been freezing periodically. And
balancing a continued presence of significant military capability on the part of the US in the region, even driving ships up through the Taiwan Strait, challenging China about access to waterways, China responding by flying any number of aircraft into the Taiwan defense zone, China building up missile capacity along the Fujian coast, and of course, Taiwan increasingly nervous, seeking greater military training, mobilization, and also support from the US side. So there's been a long debate over the last several years whether the US should give up the notion of strategic ambiguity. Is it dangerous to be ambiguous? Shouldn't it be more helpful to the Taiwan side to be very clear about what commitment the US side is making, or what the commitment means under the Taiwan Relations Act, or under Defense Department policies, or under statements made by US officials, defense officials, diplomatic officials, congressional leaders, and certainly by the president. So what do we have? Scott referred to this. Previously, President Biden has been asked about this, of course, sometimes in the context of the Ukrainian war, sometimes in the context of US-China relations, sometimes in the context of G20, sometimes in the context of the G7, very often in the context of the Quad and the meetings of the Quad, certainly in the context of the military alliances that the US still has in Asia, primarily with South Korea and with Japan. And interestingly, Joe Biden has given up very easily any notion of strategic ambiguity. On several occasions, most recently, just as Scott mentioned on this 60 Minutes interview, he doesn't hesitate. He's asked, if China had invaded Taiwan, would the US intervene on Taiwan's behalf? He says yes, and they move on. So that is an earthquake type of statement in the context of US-China relations. And of course, China immediately reacts, criticizes, interference in their internal affairs, criticizes ongoing arms sales to Taiwan, calls in the US ambassador, makes protests, and sort of ups the ante of any kind of diplomatic rhetoric related to the Taiwan matter. So Joe Biden is all in, at least in these interviews, in these statements. Now, the State Department will walk it back. People in the White House will walk it back. They'll say there's no change in policy. You know, here are the various documents, here are the various resolutions. Here's what it says in the Taiwan Relations Act, on and on. But I'm not sure that walking it back is really being accepted in Beijing. So what led to the tensions in the most recent weeks? You all know that many congressional groups have gone to Taiwan. Many cabinet officials have gone to Taiwan. Many business people have gone to Taiwan. All of these groups historically, particularly in the positive eras of US-China relations, all these same people, same congressional groups, top business executives, cabinet secretaries from the US, they all went to China, of course. There was an incredibly important relationship to manage. There's an incredibly important economic, political, civil society relationship to be managed in Taiwan. So what's the big deal, right? What's the big deal that Nancy Pelosi decides to fly off there with 5 or 6 other congressional members? Well, I think we need to keep in mind that there's a political context in mainland China, as I mentioned, about Xi Jinping's leadership. There's certainly a political context in Taiwan about democratization and about civil society, about the DPP basically consolidating its leadership there and its views on Taiwan autonomy or Taiwan independence. And then clearly in the US, given the Trump era and now the Biden era and the Pelosi era, there's a political context in the US as well. And so what is the importance of Nancy Pelosi that sort of set off the Chinese leadership, set off the Chinese military, caused the fighter planes to fly, and caused this crisis to deepen? Well, Nancy Pelosi is not your normal congressperson. She's number 2 in the line of succession to the presidency. Okay, extremely senior political leadership figure in the United States. Whether you like her or dislike her or disagree with her or agree with her, whatever you might think, after Kamala Harris, she's in line. Okay, so this was more senior. And then what is Nancy Pelosi's history with China? Nancy Pelosi has one of the longest, most consistent, most firm, most critical views of Chinese human rights violations of anyone in the Congress. She has a history way back, and particularly related to the June 4th massacre and what she said and did, how she helped people who were fleeing China at that time, and what her own political district is. Her political district, San Francisco area, is the home to many of the important human rights NGOs that deal with Asia and deal with China. In her district are many political refugees from repression in China. So she has her own political landscape.
Sorry again about the pauses here. Well, hopefully his audio will come back momentarily.
PRC human rights record. So in a sense, it's not surprising that she would want to go and make a statement and elevate this issue, given her key position in the Congress and her key position in the long debate over U.S.-China relations. Those of us who've been involved in U.S.-China relations, particularly on the educational exchange side or on the human rights side, none of us at all were surprised that Nancy Pelosi decided to go. She knew the consequences. She knew what might occur following, but that is her measured judgment about what is important in terms of protecting Taiwan's democracy or Taiwan's democratic experiment. Now, why is Taiwan so important to everybody? I mean, it's about the size of Long Island. It's 23 million people, 24 million maybe. In the broader scheme of things in the US or in China, it's small potatoes, right? Small potatoes. But that's not really the case here. I mean, here we have wrapped up in one issue a volatility of the highest order with every element of global strategy and competition that one can imagine. We have a clash of civilizations in a way. We have a clash of values politically. We have an important example of how society could develop. Many people in the China field say, Taiwan is what China should aspire to be. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party would not agree with that, but there are many in the Asian region who feel that Taiwan has been actually quite successful in the development of its social order, its political development, its democracy, its civil society, its higher education system, and certainly its technological economy. And so when it really comes down to it, we're talking about an extremely dynamic, important technological manufacturing entity that produces at the high end and at the mid-range one of the most important commodities that powers the global economy, and that's semiconductors, chips. Okay, so of course we're talking about social values, we're talking about democratization versus authoritarian one-party states, we're talking about degrees of opportunity and freedom that are quite different. We're talking about a history of alliances that are now murky and more complex. We're talking about what functioned as strategic ambiguity for 4 or 5 decades now breaking down. The strategic ambiguity is becoming just like they're sold into our economy and into the European economy and into almost every economy in the world. The major company in Taiwan that produces these things has a major market share, particularly at the high end. So you can see this is a strategically significant competition. And why is it so volatile? Why we describe it as volatile? We didn't think Ukraine was that volatile until the buildup started, and when we learned about undoing colonial domination.
Hey, Mark.
Yes.
Sorry, your audio has dropped a couple times here recently, and so you were just about talking about the Ukraine. We didn't, and that whole area just dropped out. So I'm not sure if you want to restart that.
Okay, I was talking about the importance of chips in Taiwan and basically saying that this is such a strategic point for Taiwan, both at the high end and at the mid level. And I was just saying we didn't realize how important this was, how important the volatility was. We didn't realize that so much in Ukraine until we learned about Putin's ideas of the greater Soviet Union and how he wanted to restore his empire. And I was just saying that there's a version of that in China about the harmonious society and how Xi Jinping wants to restore China to its previous glory. We have that same kind of ideology that may come into play related to the Taiwan matter. So why is it so volatile in the Taiwan case? One is that there are very slim margins of error, particularly on the military front. This is a region, an area where accidents could very easily occur because there's plenty of military hardware flying around in the air and on the water. So there's not much being done to sort of be sure that there aren't military accidents or military confrontations that get out of control. And we have very slim margins on the political side too. I mean, Xi Jinping does not have much maneuverability to be soft on Taiwan. And now with the tremendous bipartisan anti-China sentiment in the US Congress, I think Joe Biden doesn't have much sentiment, much maneuverability politically on the China matter either. And then you can imagine in Taiwan, it's a matter of their survival of the societal model that they have. So Tsai Ing-wen doesn't have much of a political margin for compromise or agreement either. So there you have, you know, slim margins on the military front, slim margins on the political front, high stakes economically, differing paradigms of social development and of values. And
You dropped out there again, Mark.
okay, I was just saying that we'll take questions now. Scott, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. And appreciate your,
Sorry for the instability there.
well, there's a lot of instability in the world these days. We might as well have it at all of U of A too.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that if it's not holding up.
Well, real quickly while I queue up some questions, can you talk a little bit more about the semiconductor dependency and why others in the world can't take up that? How did Taiwan get to be so strong with that? And what would happen? I know the US is trying to bring that back to the US if that's even possible. And what would happen to Taiwan should others become more dominant in that sector, I guess?
Well, the Taiwan company involved is called TSMC. It's an outgrowth of the computer industry in Taiwan that took many decades to develop. And they are by far the most advanced producer of these chips, particularly high-end and middle-range ones. There are other companies that do this, but nowhere near to the capacity and sophistication of the ones in Taiwan. And as you've seen that now under this new bill that's been passed in the US, there is now great government incentivization to build similar plants here. So there's one that's going to be under construction near Columbus, Ohio, and there may be others, particularly out your way, where US manufacturers will try to have the US catch up. China is trying to do this as well with tremendous government subsidy, but they have not had much success yet in doing it, particularly at the high end. So I think for the time being, we are pretty much left with the reality that the leverage of Taiwan on this matter is certainly still very strong for the next 2 or 3 years before these other plants come online.
And does that have a play if they were not the dependent maker of semiconductors? Then I assume that could change the dynamics substantially there.
Well, you can see what companies in Taiwan face if they're sort of caught in between. After the Pelosi visit, the head of TSMC was interviewed. And of course, he is extremely worried about a war that would basically ruin Taiwan's economy and ruin his business. But then what does he do? I mean, how does he maneuver between these two big superpowers who both want what he does and what he makes, and how he, you know, builds facilities in the mainland, which puts him under certain controls, or whether he cooperates and helps build factories in the US, which may undermine his market share. I know for a fact that the Taiwan authorities and the Taiwan companies have come to the US and are working with the authorities in Ohio. I think they recognize that they're sort of creating for themselves a target by being with such leverage, yet they have the technology, the skill, and they made the investment. And that this has really been a great success for Taiwan and its tech sector.
So our first question here, it comes from Richard Eason. Richard, you can unmute yourself if you'd like and ask your question.
Yes, there's actually been some news recently that the demographic issues that China confronts, partly because of its one-child policy, but it's also aging population, is starting to have an impact. Actually, I think it's going to gain speed relatively quickly, and within say 20 years, there's going to be a major problem with a rapidly aging population in China that'll affect workforce, that'll affect troops for the PLA, that'll affect all kinds of aspects of the economy. That alone, I mean, that is one challenge. They also have water issues in the North China Plain, a whole range of environmental issues. My view kind of is that China is at its peak of power right now, but there's not a whole lot anybody, including Xi Jinping, can do in the next 15 to 20 years to turn around what is major trends for China to deal with. And I'm wondering how you view that.
I very much agree with the comments you've made. In fact, the time frame may be shorter than what you've indicated. And there are a couple of other ones I would mention that are of great challenges to Xi Jinping. One is the difficulty in the banking industry and also in the property market. There's been a lot of deleveraging going on, particularly given the fact that the growth rates in China have come down so dramatically, primarily due to the pandemic. So I think the nature of the problems and pressures that Xi Jinping faces in the intermediate term, say 3 to 5 years, are far greater than people in the West realize. And then, of course, that could be a dangerous moment in terms of Taiwan. I mean, we know the political leaders have a tendency to find international crises when they might face domestic challenges. And so some people are arguing that this next period, short-term period, would be the most opportune time for Xi Jinping to try a military incursion toward Taiwan. It might be a blockade, it might be further harassment like they've been doing, but on an accelerated basis, or it might be a full military invasion. So I don't tend to agree with that view, but there are people who are making this argument. And it basically comes out of the context that you described, along with some other issues that Xi Jinping and the party face. They've been having, 6 to 16% growth rates for many decades, and yet now all of a sudden it's down below 2%. So when you have so many millions of people that you must accommodate and employ each year, it's almost impossible to do it with a growth rate of that size. So most of the people who assess the relationship between economic growth and political instability are now saying that there could be a much greater risk of political instability in China.
Our next question is from David Schauber. David, you can unmute yourself.
First of all, just a comment on the TSMC stuff. My understanding is TSMC sells both to the US and to China.
Yes, that's correct.
So there's sort of a desire on both sides to maintain a stability. But really what I'm most interested in is I welcome your comments on the role of Japan in all of this. Taiwan was part of Japan prior to World War II for a while. There are a lot of cultural ties still there. US military bases are significantly in Japan, in areas of Japan close to Taiwan. So what thoughts do you have about Japan's role in all this?
First on your TSMC comment, obviously one approach that TSMC can take is to build their own factories outside of Taiwan. I understand there's been discussions in Arizona about that. Maybe they're moving ahead with it, I'm not sure. Certainly the Ohio plant, given the new subsidies that will be available in the US legislation, is definitely going to go ahead. I know that some key people very close to the president's office in Taiwan were visiting Ohio recently, and they were involved in that discussion. In terms of Japan, Japan had a one China policy far earlier than did the US. And Japan came up with the formulation, the sort of strategic ambiguity of an earlier era some years before the US finally got around to having full diplomatic relations with the People's Republic. So in Japan, there's the same kind of tension and conflict over the factions of various political parties, particularly the ruling LDP in Japan, of the sort of pro-Taiwan element versus the pro-PRC element. And we had that in our political system too before normalization of relations. In a sense, our normalization decision happened when the Houston oil people decided it might be better to do business in big mainland China than in small Taiwan. That was basically the George Bush #1 presidency. It wasn't coincidental that he was the first liaison officer assigned to Beijing after there was the sort of the decision to head toward normalization. It didn't really happen until a bit later, but George W. Bush and the Houston oil interests, had very different views about the importance of mainland China versus just small little Taiwan. So in Japan, you have that same kind of thing. And of course, you have Japan very much under the military umbrella, the so-called nuclear umbrella of the US. So there are military and strategic concerns that Japan has that are unlike almost any other country in Asia, except for perhaps South Korea. So Japan, I think, will try to walk the delicate balance. They have very substantial economic interests in China. They developed capacities to deal with mainland China much earlier than did our country. You find business people and students and cultural organizations, Buddhist organizations, political parties that have deep, strong ties with their counterparts in mainland China. So I don't think Japan is, going to be quite so supportive of defending Taiwan as will be the US. Japan will follow along, but they will not be out front on that. And of course, if there were to be a conflict, Japan would be crucial in terms of any kind of US military involvement in that region. That would be the forward defense positions, that would be resupply, that would be air bases, that would be a lot of things if there was a conflict in that area of the Pacific over the Taiwan Strait. And Japan and Korea would, be very much obligated to be supportive of the US involvement.
My understanding is that the situation in Ukraine has prompted Japanese rethinking of military budgets. And
yes,
so there seems to be.
I think that's true all over the region because many countries, although they won't always say it publicly, they want the continued US presence of the US military in the region, but they're at the same time somewhat hesitant in thinking that the US military presence would be assured to them or would be guaranteed to them. So they have some doubts about the level of commitment of the US military should there be conflict in the Western Pacific. So I think the rebalancing during the Obama time went some way on that, but there's still a lot of hesitation, particularly if you speak to military people off the record. They're not really sure that the US would come through. And so this is why they're feeling that maybe they have to be a little more self-reliant. They have to build up capacity. They have to have pre-positioned equipment. They have to make larger military procurement decisions and purchases. And of course, this is a very happy situation for the arms suppliers. So you see the big military fairs in Asia now, it's formally, if not formally, the
Wait, sorry, Mark, you dropped there again for
I say they want to have at least informally, if not formally, U.S. military guarantees and support.
Well, Japan still has the territorial dispute with Russia as well. So,
correct. And some with China as well.
True. Thank you.
And Mark, actually, we have somebody that's interested more in the backstory of how Taiwan came to be. I know that's a whole class in itself, but could you speak a little bit to that?
Well, that's a very complicated and controversial topic on which there are many books written about sort of cultural origins of Taiwan and its colonial history. and whether it really is technically part of China or not. Certainly, under most of the dynastic periods, there were relationships between Taiwan and the central authorities of the mainland under what was then known as the suzerainty system. So it wasn't really what we would recognize today as a sovereign state or as statehood as we currently understand it, but there were certainly relationships between the people who were living in Taiwan and the people who were controlling the mainland of China, or at least parts of it. Of course, there were many parts of China that were in contestation, and there were periods of which there were warlords competing for the control of China. So it's a rather complicated story. And then you have the intervention of Western colonial powers, and part of the slicing up of China that I mentioned earlier, the more the Central Court resisted, the more European powers showed up to take different chunks of China out and to benefit from the extraction of resources. In the case of Taiwan, that was the Dutch. So the island of so-called Formosa, comes from the Dutch period. And there were times during that period where the people in Taiwan, not all of whom were ethnic Chinese, some of which were Aboriginal peoples living in the mountains, they are known as Shandiren, mountain people, sort of like Native Americans, if you will. They were non-ethnic Chinese who controlled parts of the island. They rebelled, and even at one point in the early 19th century tried to declare a republic, an independent republic, which was then suppressed. But then you had, as was mentioned by the earlier gentleman, the period prior to World War II, you had a lengthy period of Japanese occupation of Taiwan, and the building up of the island culturally, linguistically, in terms of infrastructure and all, was done greatly during the period of Japanese occupation. When I lived in Taiwan, we used to travel down island quite a bit, and we would get one price if we spoke Mandarin, and if we went a little further and learned a little bit of Taiwanese, we'd get a better price. And then way down south, if you spoke Japanese, you'd get even a better price. So it was a very complex gradation of relationships due to that Japanese colonial period. There are people in Taiwan who still have some very negative and some quite positive feelings about the period of Japanese occupation. But then after World War II, of course, what was then the nationalist government negotiated about the future of China for a few years, including the status of Taiwan. But then the Chinese Civil War intervened in the late 40s and early 50s, and the Chinese Communist Party came to power, and the Nationalist Party fled the mainland and took 2 million soldiers and a lot of artwork and a lot of riches across the strait and set up what we know today as the Republic of China on Taiwan. But then, of course, there's a whole long history from early 50s during the martial law period all the way through now of political competition and debate and opposition to martial law, and then the emergence of a party that represents the aspiration of the Taiwanese people, the 23 million out of the 25 or so million people on Taiwan, through the Democratic Progressive Party, which then came to power when the Nationalist Party sort of made a mistake and ran two candidates. And then this led to our current situation where basically the DPP is pretty much ensconced in power. And I don't think the DPP is going to be defeated in an island-wide election anytime soon.
All right, our next question is from Ralph Fine. Ralph, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
I don't even
You're
remember
unmuted.
what
I
it is.
unmuted.
So I'm just kind of curious of what difference, if any, would independence for Taiwan actually mean? Would it make any difference at all? And the other thing I'm curious about is, where do you think our allies would be if ever China tried military action and we went to fight that? Would our allies be behind it? Behind us?
No, those are very good questions, Ralph. Thank you. I can't imagine that if Taiwan declared its independence unilaterally, that the mainland would stand by for it. I mean, this is why you see such a hesitation on the part of even people in the Taiwan government who advocate independence. They're very hesitant to pursue. I was just saying that Am I okay now?
Yeah.
Okay, I was just saying that I didn't think the mainland would ever stand for a declaration of independence by the Taiwan authorities. And certainly that's not the position of the US government or anybody else who has full diplomatic relations with China. No one is advocating for independence. There are a small sector in the DPP that press for that, but they are aware of the dangers of doing that. The vast majority of the DPP leadership would prefer the status quo and then some kind of understanding about local autonomy or local governance, which basically they have now in a de facto sense. So I think that the likelihood of Taiwan independence in our lifetime is very unlikely. So then it comes down to, can there be some kind of political settlement that would be acceptable to the Taiwan people and acceptable to the mainland? And that's, of course, been the point of many, many Track 2 conferences, many, many academic treatises, many, many proposals about federation, all the debate about whether the one country, two systems model that was applied to Hong Kong and to Macau would somehow be appropriate to Taiwan. And everybody is pretty clear now that it's not, that just is a non-starter in Taiwan. I mean, the democratic genie is already out of the bottle. Taiwan is an unsinkable aircraft carrier with a strong military. So to have an imposed military solution is what people really worry about. But then if there was an imposed military solution, a war over the status of Taiwan, that would be incredibly disastrous for the global economy, incredibly disastrous for China, incredibly damaging to Taiwan, obviously. It would make Ukraine look like a tea party, frankly. I mean, it's just almost unimaginable to think of what the consequences and implications of a war would be. If such a war occurred, it seems clear now from President Biden's comments that he feels the US would come to Taiwan's aid if it was a clear, unprovoked invasion, like you have Russia versus Ukraine. If it was unprovoked PRC attack or act of war toward Taiwan, then the US would feel its commitment to Taiwan. In those circumstances, if it was a clear invasion by the PRC, I have little doubt that the US military alliances and military friends in the region would not come to the US's aid. I think they would feel obligated. There are long histories of friendship. There are very long histories of military cooperation. There are pre-positioning of equipment. There are military bases. I mean, the whole 7th Fleet and the US military posture is basically all over the perimeter of China. And I think you would have pretty full support, even from those who right now are not really coming much to the US's side, verbally speaking. In their heart of hearts, they know that their old friend that they have in the region, that a friend like that they might fear is better than a friend that they don't know about, who they fear even more, and that's the rising China.
Our next question comes from Leslie Bailey, who had a couple comments along the way. Leslie, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Do you have any comment about Nancy Pelosi's recent trip to Armenia? I realize this is outside of your area of expertise, but it just seemed to kind of echo her trip to Taiwan, in that it seemed to invite controversy.
Well, I don't know that much about the history of Armenia or of Nancy Pelosi's involvement in that issue, so I really couldn't comment too much. I know there have been legislative proposals for many, many years trying to address what is described as the atrocities that occurred in Armenia and give some resolution or some recognition to those horrible events. I would be willing to bet that there's some domestic political dimension of that too with the Armenian population in the US, but I really don't know. And of course, Nancy Pelosi is a very long-term human rights advocate. Again, this is not something that we should be surprised about or something that's new to her political career.
Okay. And then another kind of strange question. Do you know anything about the novel called A Pail of Oysters about Taiwan, written in the 1950s?
No, afraid not. Sorry.
Thanks.
All right, and our next question, one second here, is Bridget, and I'm gonna mispronounce your last name, Bridget. Is it Risechi? I'm guessing, but
You're close. It's Richechi.
oh,
but-
that was my first instinct, and I didn't go with it. So thank you.
But that is just fine. Can you, I actually have a comment. One is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation is building a very large manufacturing facility in the Phoenix area. Secondly, can you talk a little bit about the use of the term the Republic of China versus Taiwan? And is the Republic of China term the formal name not used because it's too confusing for people? Perhaps?
Yeah, I'm glad to hear about this investment. I'm not surprised that TSMC is going to diversify in terms of location. They certainly have a dominant market position, and they should, in my view, take full advantage of that, given the incredible technological skill that they seem to demonstrate in producing these devices. Maybe they'll go into joint ventures, maybe they'll have incentives from different states to bring these factories there for employment purposes. That seems to be the case in Ohio. And I'm sure there's going to be subsidies on the part of the US government, given the new legislation that was just passed, the so-called CHIPS Act, which seeks to lessen US dependence on overseas produced chips so that the production would be domestic. It might be done by an international company, it might be done by a domestic company, but it would then be produced here and would not be subject to the same supply chain disruptions that we've seen, either due to shipping or due to pandemic. Remind me of your other question quickly.
My
I'm
other
sorry.
question is the use of the
Okay, got it.
name
Okay.
Taiwan versus Republic of China. Why or why not? And is it too confusing for people?
Well, as you can gather in this whole discussion, the terms you use often indicate your political position. And so it's a sort of linguistic minefield always of how you describe the status of the People's Republic of China or mainland China versus the Republic of China on Taiwan or Taiwan. The Republic of China existed on the mainland before the Chinese Civil War. So when Chiang Kai-shek was in office in the mainland with the capital in Nanjing, mainland China was known as the Republic of China. It wasn't really a republic. It was still something of a one-party dictatorship then too. But mainland China then, during the Second World War and shortly after, was known as the Republic of China. The People's Republic of China did not exist until October 1st, 1949. So when the communists won the Chinese Civil War and basically pushed the nationalists to Taiwan, it was a process of about 2 years of civil war fighting, in some areas of the country, even longer than 2 years. The People's Republic of China was declared in Beijing at Tiananmen Square on October 1st, when Mao Zedong stood on that balcony and said, the Chinese people have stood up. And they established a new government, a new revolutionary government controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So then the Republic of China was in flight and fled. Chiang Kai-shek and his forces were pushed south and then decamped from the mainland and went across to Taiwan. So the Republic of China existed on Taiwan from 1949-50, basically all the way through to the present, okay? The first few decades of the Republic of China on Taiwan were under martial law because the status of Taiwan at that point was still in the context of a civil war, even up until the mid-70s. I mean, when I was there as a graduate student, it was still under martial law. We had surveillance and we had police and we were monitored and all the rest, because there was still a lot of political repression in Taiwan to impose the Republic of China on what was before the island of Taiwan, which had its own history and its own governance. Then as the struggle for democratization occurred in Taiwan, and the political parties were finally allowed, almost by accident, the Taiwan political system was reformed and evolved into a multiple party political system. And then the nationalist party's domination and monopoly was challenged, and new parties and new civil society organizations emerged, and martial law was ended. And even the nationalist party itself started to reform and realize that it had to govern Taiwan in a more pluralistic fashion. And so when the Kuomintang made the mistake of having two candidates run, then almost by accident, the DPP candidate, the Democratic Progressive Party candidate, a man named Chen Shui-bian, was elected. He won, I think, with 39% of the vote. But then you then had, for the first time, an opposition party candidate winning. So the period of sort of Kuomintang domination, Kuomintang or Nationalist Party, one party control was broken. And so now you have in Taiwan a series of elections, pretty free and fair elections, very vibrant political competition. But Taiwan is still, as a state, still known as the Republic of China on Taiwan, but no one hardly in the world recognizes Taiwan as the Republic of China. They recognize China as the People's Republic of China in Beijing. And when they do that, when you make an agreement to have full diplomatic relations with China, you must basically say, you must basically ascribe to the one China policy, meaning that Taiwan is part of China, okay? If you do not agree to that, Beijing will not agree to have diplomatic relations with you. So the 14 or 15 states that still have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, they recognize the Republic of China as China. They do not recognize the People's Republic as China. Because you can't have two Chinas. Neither side allows you to have two Chinas, or one China, one Taiwan. In other words, you'd have diplomatic relations with both. That is not allowed by either party. And in that sense, both parties agree that there is one China, but you have to choose. Okay, so technically, the Republic of China still exists on Taiwan, but we refer to it as Taiwan because almost nobody diplomatically recognizes the Republic of China as the government. It's complicated, I agree. It's sort of a confusing history and confusing terminology. So just to give you an example of how strange and confusing it can be, when you're at a big university and you have students from People's Republic and from Taiwan, they often are in conflict about where they come from and which government they're loyal to and all that. And you don't want to have conflict like this amongst all the Chinese students from all the different parts of China, right? You don't want to have conflict with the mainland students, with the Taiwan students, with the Hong Kong students, with the Singaporean students, with the Macau students, all that. So what do? And most universities that I know, certainly we did this in Hong Kong too, you say no flags. So if you want to have clubs, fine. If you want to say you're the mainland Chinese student club, fine, but no flags. Don't declare loyalty to one or other governments. That's just not useful in this context. So you sort of denationalize the whole issue. And then you find out that the students from China, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, from Macau, from wherever they're from, in the diaspora, from Philippines, wherever, they all get along pretty well. And they all learn from each other. But you don't have to have them involved in the political conflict over the status and future of Taiwan.
Next question is Patricia Solar. If you'd like to unmute yourself, Patricia, and ask your question. There you go.
Hi there. Yes, I'm wondering if you think that the outcome of the war between Russia and Ukraine could have any impact on the possibility of war between China and Taiwan. In other words, are either of these two countries, China and Taiwan, looking at what's going on between Russia and Ukraine and the support of the people trying to help Ukraine, and maybe thinking about what will happen next for us if Russia manages to win the war?
Without a doubt. The person most interested in this is Xi Jinping himself. He has to judge to what degree he's sort of linking himself to the Putin war, and to what degree will he agree to support the Putin war in Ukraine, and what lessons will he learn given the possible outcome of the war in Ukraine. So if Putin wins and is able to, in a sense, destroy Ukrainian sovereignty, destroy Ukrainian identity, and reabsorb Ukraine into the greater Russia, maybe Xi Jinping will draw one conclusion. If he sees that Putin's adventure is ill-advised and he finds himself in a quagmire and the Ukrainians either hold out or even win, then I think Xi Jinping will draw a different conclusion, okay? And I don't know if you've noticed, China and Russia have a very strong alignment right now, much stronger than existed in the last 2 decades. And Xi Jinping was just in Central Asia at a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is the first time he's been outside of China since the pandemic, so almost 3 years. And of course, that's all about competition over the various states of Central Asia, which are very important in energy politics. But he met there with Putin, okay? And you may have noticed that the readout of the meeting was very different from Putin than it was from Xi Jinping. Putin basically said, you know, we consider Putin took our views very seriously and, you know, studied the lessons of what we're trying to do. And Xi Jinping sort of backed away from the whole thing. He sort of is not declaring any particular view just yet about what the outcome of Ukraine may be. So I think your question is very relevant, but mostly relevant to what the Chinese government concludes from what happens in Ukraine, okay? I think there's pretty strong evidence that he's discovering that probably the West would come to Taiwan's aid, that certain Asian countries would also come to Taiwan's aid, and that it might be great damage to his most important objective, which is the economic rise of China, okay? He may have to wait a little longer to recover Taiwan to Chinese sovereignty. That's my humble opinion.
Our next question is from Anna Don. Anna, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Oh, I just have a small question. Do the Taiwanese comply with this one China policy? I mean, they're living together. It seems like they're coexisting. So what's the problem here?
Well, Taiwan does not follow the one China policy. Taiwan is basically de facto an independent state and determines its own domestic policies internally. They have never had the restriction on childbirth and on family planning that has existed in the tremendously populous mainland. You know, the mainland is 1.3 billion people. And so they had a very restrictive birth planning policy up until fairly recently. And as one of your earlier questioners indicated, now they're worried a bit that the population is aging too fast, that they won't have enough younger people and young workers. So they have actually liberalized and eased the one-child policy quite significantly in the last 3 or 4 years. So the draconian aspects of the one-child policy are not even existing in the mainland now. But there's never been the one-child policy in Taiwan. So people can have as many children as they want. There's not the same kind of intrusive policies that exist in the mainland related to your birth planning status. That was primarily a policy of PRC, of mainland China.
And looks like we lost him again. So while Mark's coming back, we'll go to the next question. Zambor Zoltan, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yes, since the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is such an incredible, powerful corporation, would you, do you know anything a little bit to inform us, which I think is very important, about Morris Chang, the founder, and his background? And
no, I don't really know too much about him. I like you, I'm incredibly impressed with this company, as I am with
Right. Well, he's spent many, many years in the United States. He came to, he's a Harvard graduate and went to MIT and didn't manage to get his PhD there. And then he worked for several major semiconducting companies in the United States. And in 1987, he brought his expertise to Taiwan, and he actually created a very strategic company that so I mean he's basically powerfully influenced. I mean his entire career happened in the United States until 1987.
Yeah, well, you'll find that that's extremely common in Taiwan.
Right.
The wave of Taiwanese students who came out about the same time I started to go to grad school. And
Right.
I had roommates and good friends in Hawaii who were from Taiwan. And many of them have a career that's not unlike how you've just described.
Right.
And the same is now true in mainland China. It's a little
Right.
bit later of an echo, but there's so many highly trained, highly mobile, Western trained business people, technologists, computer scientists. I mean, this is the story of the rise of East Asia, of Korea, of Japan, and Taiwan earlier, and then now mainland China as well, with usually Hong Kong as part of the managerial talent or part of the brokerage or accounting work. That's the model of East Asia's rise. So what you've described, I didn't know him well, but what you've described is not at all surprising to me.
And he also, therefore, because he also does a lot of business with China, as well as the United States, he doesn't sell them the same, highest end material, but nevertheless, he's created sort of an umbrella, a strategic umbrella over Taiwan, because if that capacity gets, fired upon, it would be a critical problem for everybody, not just China, but US. I mean, until we get rid of our dependency.
Yes, I agree with you about the critical problem, although I must sadly remind you that in the past, when China had to choose over economic development versus sovereignty, they often chose sovereignty. So right. I think we have to be sober-minded that maybe the economic umbrella that you described may not be as strong as we would wish.
Thank you.
Well, Mark, our time is running out here, but I know there was one question in here that kind of more related to Hong Kong, about how many people left Hong Kong. And I know that, from my understanding anyway, that a number of people from Hong Kong did go to Taiwan as well. So I'm kind of curious, one, about helping answer that question about how many people have fled Hong Kong and maybe the connections between Taiwan and Hong Kong today.
Well, as you know, Scott, Hong Kong has always been a place where there's been churning, where there's been people coming in, people going out. That's the sort of the history of the place. In different phases, different waves. The most recent phase, of course, caused by the national security law, is from 2020 to the present. And there are many, many pathways out and many, many motivations for people leaving, some on an emergency basis to avoid political persecution. Some of the earliest activists who felt they had to flee right away did go to Taiwan, and they were warmly welcomed there. Even some that served jail terms, including some of my own academic colleagues at the university where I worked, served their jail times for various violations, assembly violations and things like that, or involvement in the Yellow Umbrella protests in 2014. Some of them served 14 to 18 months prison, and then they left later. They went to Taiwan after they served their jail time. And then now we have a much broader and much more extensive pathway out. And the biggest one is still the British National Overseas Passport, which means that anybody who was born in Hong Kong before 1997 has access to a British National Overseas Passport, and a special provision now in the British law that says they can find status and then remain as British citizens in Britain after a period of residency. So that is now leading to about 100,000 a month going out. So you could have in the year or two since the national security law, upwards of 800,000 to 1 million people leave Hong Kong. And these will be the most talented, the people who speak English, very likely, people who have money and have skills and can find their way to reorganize their lives outside. And they will cause many difficulties to the medical services, to the teaching corps, to finance, even to civil service in Hong Kong by these departures. And we're seeing the results of that now, a kind of draining away, a kind of waning away in the school system. Certainly university academics, many of my colleagues have decided to leave if they have a way. And then of course, people always say, well, they can be easily replaced. And that's true. I mean, the churning and the in-migration from the mainland has always been a factor. And that's almost an unlimited supply of people who may want to wish to move to Hong Kong. And then of course, so maybe these people can be easily replaced, but then you have to ask the question, then is that still Hong Kong? I mean, it's a kind of internal replacement, or some people say internal occupation. So we have a very serious process now of out-migration on the one hand, some of it due to the pandemic, certainly a heavily churning of the expatriate community. Many people blocked from coming back in, given all the COVID restrictions to get in and out of Hong Kong these days. And then certainly there'll be an in-migration. There'll be new people coming from the mainland, and there'll have to be new procedures for professional quality. Now, sorry,
Okay.
I'm dropping out like that. I think we better stop, Scott, because I'm dropping out too much.
No, well, the last part of that I was curious about is just the connection of then anybody that left Hong Kong for Taiwan. Is this a whole nother, is it a large population segment of Taiwan now, or
Not as large, no, not as large as the group going to England, and then of course many Hong Kong people had relatives in Australia, New Zealand, Canada. So very large numbers of people already had status. They had a foreign passport for years. So now they're exercising their right to live in those places and leaving.
Right. Well, thank you again so much for another presentation. And for those of you that are interested in some of the Hong Kong perspectives, our video and conversation from a year ago with Mark is on our YouTube channel on that as well. And Mark, your experience and expertise is amazing as always, and we really appreciate having you, and hope to have you join us again for another discussion.
I'd be happy to do so, Scott. Thank you so much.
Thank you to everybody who joined us today, and have a great week at Ollie. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Yep. Bye-bye.